Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. In this video I want to show you my game against the chess legend Vassily Ivanchuk from the Sharjah Masters tournament, which was already now I believe 1 or 2 months back. But it's one of my most memorable games. Even playing against such a legend and winning against him doesn't happen every day, and the title doesn't lie, so stick around until the end to find out how I managed to make Ivanchuk jump from his chair. So let's have a look at the game. I was black here. Mr. Ivanchuk played e4. I went for e5, and we got the so-called Spanish opening, or the Ruy Lopez, and I went for knight f6, which is the Berlin defense. It is one of the most solid openings, especially played very frequently on the top level, and it has an extremely solid reputation. One of the best defenses against the Ruy Lopez. Ivanchuk went for d3 here, which is called the anti-Berlin. Short castle is the main move by far, but after knight takes e4, the game has been this opening has been analyzed pretty deeply, and rook e1 knight d6. This is one of the lines where we get this symmetrical position where it's hard to create chances with white, so he did not want to go there. d4 is the other line where we get this famous Berlin endgame, where again black is very solid and it's not easy to create chances as white. So it's an understandable choice that Vassily Ivanchuk went for d3 against me. I played bishop c5. d6 is the other move, simply protecting the pawn on e5, and later on often black develops the bishop on the king side, which is also a very solid defense for black. But I went for bishop c5, developing the bishop, and now he went knight bd2. White has quite some options here. One of them is to take on c6, and after d takes c6, white often argues that simply his pawn structure is better, because now black has these doubled pawns. But black has the bishop there, and again, at least objectively, black is doing pretty well here. Knight takes e5 doesn't work because of queen d4. This is quite important, and now black would be winning because of this double attack here. Another move for white is to go c3, and then we often get some sort of position like this, where black could go for d6, where we now kind of have an Italian just with the bishop being on b5, and this is totally okay for black. I had a game earlier in this tournament against Aydin Suleimanli, who is rated 26-21, and there I went for d5, and in this game I just wanted to point out, later in the game there was a very instructive motive which I played here. I was black in this game as well, and here it's actually a nice exercise, so if you would like to think, you can stop the video for some time and try to figure out the best way to continue as black here. I went for knight b8 here, which is a quite typical regrouping here, because I figured out that the knight on c6 doesn't do much anymore. He's totally restricted by the pawn on c3, and also the pawn on c7 cannot move with the knight still being on c6. So I played knight b8, and now first of all, I'm looking at this square, which can be accessed by knight bd7, knight b6, then the knight could come to c4, and also now I have the idea to push c5 sooner or later, creating some weaknesses on the queen side. My opponent played knight e3 and offered a draw, which I accepted. Position is still roughly balanced, but I'm already on the slightly better side, so it's understandable that my opponent was happy with the draw here. But let's get back to the game. He went for knight bd2, and I went for castle because now still he cannot take here and take on e5, because again queen d4 would win the piece because of the double attack on f2 and on e5. He went for knight b3, and I actually still checked this line for the previous games, because it's quite a sideline, but it has been played more recently by some players. I think even Anand played it with white, so it had to be taken seriously, and I went for bishop b6, which I still checked. Bishop d6 is the other option, but after castle a6 takes bishop g5 might be a bit unpleasant for black with this pin, and yeah, so I didn't want to go for this. Bishop b6 was still my preparation, and now he took on c6, b takes c6. Now I cannot take on c6 with the d pawn anymore, because now after knight takes e5, I don't have queen deformer anymore, and white would just be up a healthy pawn. So I took on c6 with the b pawn, and now he went for h3, which is a bit too slow. He should have gone knight e5, which was still part of my preparation, but after d5, black is okay. I'm just opening up the position for my bishop pair, and white is still a bit underdeveloped, so he cannot really take the pawn on d5. Could run into rook e8 or these sorts of things. With this pin, could already be pretty bad for white. My preparation went as follows. It was short castle and now d takes e4, and if white goes a4, threatening to trap the bishop with a5, I simply go a5 myself, and black has a lot of activity here. I still remember d takes e4, queen e7 was important to keep the queens on the board, and then I'm getting the pawn on e4. And I also have these ideas like bishop a6, and the pawn on f2 could be quite a target later on. He went h3. He already started to think quite a long time here, so it was obvious to me that he wasn't prepared that deeply in this line, which was a good sign. But h3 was also new for me, so I had to figure out what to do next. I went for d6 after quite a long thought. I had the feeling here that I should go d5, just grab the center immediately, and it would be by far the best choice. In the game, I was just worried that now my pawn structure could be a bit weak, and white often has this idea with c4, threatening c5 to completely lock out my bishop. And I wasn't sure if I'm in time to create threats in time, but it turns out I am, and after a5 I'm already much better. Because bishop a6 is coming, often this diagonal can open up after d takes e4, also threatening a4, so I should have gone for d5, but I went for d6, simply staying more solid and keeping the pawn structure a bit more intact. He went bishop e3, I went knight d7. I could have taken here, but now the f-file opens up, and I even thought that he could maybe attack here with g4 or g5, and maybe even castle queenside, and could become a bit dangerous for me. So I didn't want to take yet. I played knight d7, with the idea that often I have f5, and with this bishop coming to this diagonal, and sooner or later playing c5, this f5 push is quite thematic and strong. Went for castle, I went bishop b7. I could have gone c5 right away to immediately push f5, which might have been a bit better, but I thought bishop b7 is logical. Anyway, the bishop should belong on this diagonal, at least that's what I thought during the game. He went rook e1. I went rook b8 in the game. I also considered f5, but here after takes d4, I wasn't entirely sure what happens. The computer says I'm fine with many different continuation. In the game I calculated c5, and here lots of pieces exchange. And I felt I should be fine here, but I wasn't entirely sure. It turns out this position is just that equal. Rook endgames in general tend to be very drawish, so it makes sense here. But I didn't want to risk something going wrong in my calculation, so I simply went rook b8 and stayed flexible. I thought the rook will anyway be useful on the b file, and I could play f5 in the future as well. He played a4, and now I took on e3. Because I thought sooner or later I have to, even if he plays a5. Or what I also thought is, let's say I make some move like this, it could be dangerous for him to move his bishop and then to go a5, because now he's already threatening to win this bishop. So I took on e3. He went f takes e3, which was kind of a surprise. I thought if he went rook e1 before, he probably intends to take with the rook here. But yeah, he took with the f-pawn. After rook e3, I simply go c5, and I'm also very much fine here now. f5 is really coming pretty soon. He went fe3, I went c5, knight d2, and here g6 I think was quite instructive, because I want to go f5, but in the optimal case I would like to take back on f5 with the g-pawn. So he went b3, f5, and just to demonstrate, if he takes now, I would like to take with the g-pawn, because now the g-file opens up for my rooks, and in connection with this bishop on b7, which controls this diagonal pretty well, this can become very dangerous for white. So he didn't take on on e4, on f5 for that reason. He went rook f1, I played queen e7, queen e2, and I went rook f7, preparing to double the rooks on the f file. And here I'm already quite a bit better, because I simply have a lot of pressure here in the center, and my bishop on b7 is a pretty strong piece. After rook f2, I went rook f8, and here I believe knight f8 would have been a bit smarter. The knight goes to e6, where sooner or later I could also have the idea to play f4, and then the knight controls this d4 square and this f4 square later on. What I would like to add as well is that I was never that sure to take on e4. I do get a better pawn structure here, but I thought knight takes e4, and if bishop e4, d takes e4. And now I thought his queen opens up, and with moves like queen a6, he could target my pawns on the queen side. So I didn't want to open up this diagonal yet for him. That's why I tried to strengthen my position, but rook f8, as I said, I think the knight should go to e6 first and then only rook f8. Rook f8, rook f1, and here I went h6. My point was to sometimes have knight f6 as an option without knight g5 being possible, and also in the long term, yeah, simply to control this square on g5. He went king h2, I went king g7, and this was already a slight inaccuracy. H6 was also not perfect, but I think it's still a normal move. King h8 was better according to the engine, but it's hard to figure out what is exactly the plan. Computer gives moves like rook f8 and then rook g7, simply preparing for ef5, gf5, but white doesn't take, and then it's kind of like a waiting game. So h6, king h2, and king g7 was an inaccuracy. I should have gone f4 now, and if he takes, I always have e takes f4, and then I have this plan with g5, rook g7 possibly, and then h5, g4, with again a pretty good position for me. I went king g7, and now he played e takes f5, which I totally underestimated, and the point now, I would like to take with the pawn on f5, but now he has g3, followed by knight h4, and now my pawn on f5 could become a target. That's why I went for rook takes f5, not to create this weakness on f5. Ivanchuk went e4, I went back with the rook, knight c4, knight f6, knight d2, bishop c8. Now with the pawn already being on e4, I realized my bishop doesn't do that much anymore on b7, so I went to regroup it to the more active square on e6, where it also, on this diagonal, it looks on the king side, so I might have some ideas there as well. Knight e3, bishop e6, and he went queen e1, which I think was a very classy move. So I was really impressed by this decision. The queen here does two things. Well, it does nothing yet, but in the future his plan was to play knight c4 and then queen a5, targeting my weak pawn here on a7. And also one idea was that the queen could come to g3 possibly, looking at my king here, so there might be some attacking possibilities for him there. I went knight g8. Originally my plan was to play knight h5. I simply wanted to release the pressure along the f-file and exchange the rooks. But I wasn't sure here if he takes everything and plays a position like this, simply king g1, and now there's always queen a5 in the picture, and I thought, yeah, that this could be a bit unpleasant for black. The computer says it's still fine, but I think practically it's not so easy for black here. I went knight g8, and now I always had the plan that the knight could come to c6 via e7, and then my pawn on e7 is protected, and also this square on a5 is not accessible to the queen on e1 anymore. He took on f7, I took back, and now he went knight f3, which again I think was a very good practical decision, not exchanging the rook just yet and keeping me under more pressure. I went queen f8, so that after queen f5, which he played, I have queen b8 to protect the pawn on a7. He went queen b5, queen c8. I don't want to take here, because then the pawn on a7 can easily be attacked by rook a1, and this looks pretty bad already for black. I went queen c8, and he went b4, which again was a very good move, because now everything is protected here. My pawn structure is weaker than his, but it's very solid. But with b4, he's opening up this b file, which could later also be strengthened by the rook from f1 coming to b1. I went a6 first, queen a5, cb4, queen b4. I could have also taken on b4 right away. It probably doesn't make a lot of difference, but I thought that if I go a6 first, then at least my pawn is on a protected square, and later on it cannot be attacked with the tempo anymore. I went knight e7, proceeded as planned, with knight c6 being an idea sooner or later, queen c3, king h7, simply stepping out of this diagonal so that there are no tricks like knight takes e5 or d4 opening the diagonal, and the king is very safe on h7 for now. He went a5, queen b7, queen a1, queen a7, and here he went queen d2, threatening knight g4. So for example, if I do nothing here, then knight g4 would win the game already because bishop takes g4, knight g5 check, f takes g5, and rook takes f7. White is simply winning. That's why I played king g7, because now after knight g4, if bishop takes g4, there is no knight g5 with a check along the f-file as well. He could have gone c3 here as well, instead of queen d2, to try to push d4 right away. That was one of the computer suggestions as well. I went king g7, and here he went d4. Forcing matters. Now I have to take on d4. Knight takes d4. Rook takes f1. And he took back with the knight on f1. There was one very interesting continuation for him, which we also briefly talked about after the game, which is knight takes e6 check, an intermediate check, which looks very dangerous at first. But here I have only one continuation to keep the balance, which is king f7. So I'm deliberately running into this check on d8, but simply after king e8, there's nothing for him. After knight takes f1, I can simply take on d8 and I'm totally fine. But king f6, which might look more logical, not stepping into this check. Now white can play knight d8 simply, and my king on f6 is simply very, very weak. The rook on f1 is hanging, and white has all sorts of threats, like knight g4 with mate, queen c3 is there. So yeah, that was the point here. Knight takes c6 check, king f7, and the position is roughly balanced. Played knight takes f1. I went back with the bishop, queen c3. Again, I have to step out of this diagonal with king g8. Knight d2, queen b7, knight f3, queen c6. So in general, I really wanted to trade queens here because my king is kind of loose and can be under some danger at some point. He went queen f6. I played queen d7, and here the unspeakable happened. Ivanchuk lost on time, and yeah, it was a huge shock to everyone. Even the people around us were looking and didn't understand what happened. All of a sudden I won, but there was no additional 30 minutes after move 40 in this tournament, so it was very stressful to play the whole game only with 90 minutes plus 30 seconds, and there were so many options for him here, so that he simply forgot about the time, and yeah, I won on time in this position. When he lost on time, then he kind of jumped from his from his chair, and obviously he was very shocked. So yeah, that's also the explanation behind the title of the video. I think he intended to play e5, but I would have gone queen e6 here, and the position is equal anyway. He can trade queens now, but the endgame is totally fine for me. Pawn on a5 could also be a target, attacked by knight c6. He could also go queen f4, but here I have many options again. I could go king g7, I could even go g5, hitting the queen, and the position is equal here. I think it would have ended in a draw, but we will never find out. So yeah, anyway, this was this game against Ivanchuk. I think it was overall a pretty good game from the quality. Of course, it was not an entirely deserved winning on time, but it's part of the game, and I was just very happy to play against such a chess legend in general, and it was a very memorable experience. And yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this kind of post recap already after some time after the tournament, and yeah, I hope to see you in the upcoming videos. Until then, yeah, all the best.